Hello, I'm Bob Orr, and this is Washington Unplugged. Today, of course, is the somber anniversary of 9/11. And 8 years later, the pain is still fresh and vulnerabilities remain. And in the U.S., in many ways, we're still on a hair trigger. That obviously played out this morning when CNN erroneously reported that the Coast Guard had fired on a small boat on the Potomac River, near where the president was commemorating the attack on the Pentagon. Flights were stopped at Reagan National Airport. We're told FBI agents went running out the door, and security command centers all around the city snapped to attention.
Should not be. It's not unusual to see boaters inadvertently come into a Coast Guard security zone, but usually when the Coast Guard says, whoa, wait a minute, stop, this isn't where you're supposed to be, they turn around and they hightail it out of there. This person seems intent, or people seem intent on trying to violate that zone. For what purpose, we can't possibly say, but the Coast Guard putting up a defense at this point.
Yeah. Now, that was earlier this morning, and clearly now we know that CNN made a mistake. It was all a training exercise, and no shots were fired at all. But the security concerns are real. Al-Qaeda remains a dangerous and a committed enemy. In an exclusive interview this morning, former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff, who's in London, told our producer Rob Hendon that 8 years later, we're safer, but not totally safe.
I still believe that. We are clearly safer, and I think the proof of the pudding is that we have not had a successful attack in the United States since 9/11. But if you look at what's going on around the world, it's obvious that the terrorists are very active. They're still pursuing operations in other parts of the globe, and therefore we have to assume they're going to continue to probe us and to press us. And if they find that we are dropping our guard, we're going to start to see negative consequences.
What about their ability to train and recruit? What has happened there?
Well, again, we know that they deliberately sought to recruit Westerners whom they believe can operate freely in the West without detection. And part of what they did is they brought them in, they trained them in the safe havens in the frontier area, with the idea being to send them back. Now, to the extent we have made it harder to operate, that we've managed to kill or incapacitate them, that we've made it more difficult to be visible, we've certainly put roadblocks in their ability to do that training. On the other hand, I've got to say, look at Somalia. We do see Westerners going to Somalia to fight, and if some of those go back home again, having been trained and battle-hardened, that's going to create a new threat in much the same way as people going to Chechnya to fight became a threat in Western Europe.
Let me ask you about homegrown terrorism. When you were Secretary, there were a couple of plots while you were Justice as well that were uncovered in the United States. I mean, how much of a threat are domestic threats from homegrown terrorism? Well,
we've had a problem in Europe, for example, that's been much greater than the United States. But we have seen some homegrown plots in the Fort Dix plot, some of the other cases that have been reported in the last year or so. And again, the concern is, do we begin to see an intensification of this kind of homegrown activity? Now, the real solution here is to work with the communities where recruiting takes place to counteract that recruiting. And that means getting the community to recognize that it has a major role to play in counteracting radical propaganda and extremist propaganda, and also in notifying the authorities if they begin to see people conducting operational preparations inside the United States.
You know, one of the things that you've always talked about is the soft target of transportation and airlines with trains and subways. What has been done recently to protect our transportation infrastructure that isn't airline, that trains, buses, and subways?
We know that, of course, the challenge with public transportation, trains and buses, is that the architecture is so open that you can't duplicate the kind of screening that we do at the airport. But there are a number of things we've done. First of all, at the federal government level, we put a lot more resources into mobile teams, including teams equipped with canines, that could make themselves present, particularly when there's information that there might be increased risk. And that, again, helps us deal with the possibility of someone coming in with explosives. Another element is technology. As we get better at finding a capability to screen for explosives in a mobile environment, that's going to give us additional ability to reduce the risk in mass transit. One of the key elements is to look at the whole system and see what are the areas where there's the greatest vulnerability and there'd be the worst consequence. and we undertook a number of measures, many of which I can't talk about publicly, that were specifically designed to reduce the risk of an attack in an area where there might be a really mass casualty effect. And so it's that risk management approach that I think is the key to dealing with the subways and the mass transit.
Finally, we're 8 years out. Are you worried that now that we haven't seen an attack on U.S. soil, that as we progress in the Congress with the budget deficits, that there's going to be a hesitancy to continue to fund some of these homeland security programs?
I do worry about that. Obviously, I understand there are a lot of competing priorities, but I know that the most important thing a government can do is keep the citizens safe. I know that some of the threats that we're facing, particularly in the medium to long term, which could be devastating, biological threats, radiological threats, require investment over a long period of time in order to make sure we can protect ourselves if and when these weapons begin to become more available to terrorists. And I know if we wait until the last minute, it's going to be too late. So we're forced to ask the public and the politicians to be disciplined and committed to investing, even though the benefit of the investment may not be felt until 5 or 10 years from now. But I think this is what we owe our children, and we owe those who lost loved ones in September 11th and in other terrorist attacks.
And that includes remaining vigilant at all times, even though people haven't seen anything happen.
Exactly right. I mean, I tell you, one lesson I've learned over here in London, talking to people as well as back in the United States, is it is not uncommon that an individual who saw something suspicious and raised the issue to the authorities turned out to provide the key to frustrating a plot. So, this see something, say something motto really has produced benefits, and we don't want people to be panicked or to see a terrorist under every bed, but we do want people to speak up when they see something that is suspicious or alarming.
I'm joined now from New York by Jim Whitaker, a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Global Leadership Network. He recently produced a documentary on the rebuilding of Ground Zero, which will become a permanent fixture in the Ground Zero Museum. Thanks very much for joining us today on 9/11. And I'd like to just find out, first of all, tell me a little bit about the film. What should we expect? We're seeing some clips now of the time-lapse sequence.
Well, just about 8 years ago now, I installed some cameras at Ground Zero, film cameras, that have been taking a frame of film every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day for the past 8 years, capturing the rebuilding of the site from a distance, but also as time progressed, close up, to be able to see the evolution of the site through the Path train station to the building of building number 7, and to the formation of the memorial, which is in progress right now.
It's an amazing sequence to watch. I mean, it's fascinating. How many cameras involved?
Well, we started out with 3, triangulating the site, and then 3 eventually turned into 6, and now there's 14 cameras in and around the site at high angles and also at low and close angles, just capturing both the wide and the very specific close shots of the building as it progresses.
So you literally are capturing the rebirth, if you will, of that hallowed ground down there in Lower Manhattan. What was in your mind, Jim, when you started out with this project? What were you hoping to achieve?
Well, I went to Ground Zero about a month after September 11th with my wife, and I had said to her that I wanted to go there because if one day in the future when we had children, I was given the opportunity to tell them about what happened, I wanted to be able to say it and say it from my own experience. So when I went down there, I saw the debris and the wreckage, and as I looked at it, I felt this sense, of course, of dread and anxiety, but I started to think, wow, one day this place is going to look very different. And if it did, what would that feel like? What would that look like? And I had just a tiny kind of upswelling of hope. And it was this idea that if I could do a film that could compress what was actually happening, that you could take an audience from this sense of real fear and anxiety to a place of feeling some hope. And that's really the idea behind the film. It's a film about the reconstruction of the site, but it's also, I've been following the lives of 10 people who were affected by the day and charting their emotional growth and emergence from grief. So in a way, it's kind of a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
9/11 touched so many people across the country. Of course, we know, it took nearly 3,000 lives there in New York. How did you decide which 10 people? What would be a representative sample? Who were you going for?
Well, I was trying to sort of think about who was affected in a kind of 360-degree perspective. So, for example, a fireman who lost many of his friends, a woman who was on the impact floor where the plane hit but survived, a police officer who was in charge of fresh kills, a woman who lost her fiance, a young boy who lost his mom. In many respects, I was just trying to think about it in the way the cameras actually are set up. I was looking around the site and setting the cameras up in a way to kind of cover it in the same way I was thinking about the emotional toll that had happened and a humanistic toll, and thinking how could I cover it from as many perspectives as possible.
Kind of interesting in looking at the time-lapse sequence, you see kind of the physical redoing, but what about the whole emotional redoing of the people involved? I mean, you're trying to get at that too.
Yeah, and it's really important. I mean, honestly, it's been amazing to watch. It's a year-by-year, incremental and at times very dramatic movement from a coping that you see to almost to a healing that starts to take place as these people who had, you know, experienced this extraordinarily difficult thing begin to start to approach it and kind of attack it to try and begin to heal. And so in that process, you slowly start to see the resilience come into play, and then you see the emotional, you know, kind of upswelling of them as they get beyond it, to the extent that that's possible.
When people view the film, I mean, obviously very powerful, it's still raw emotions for many people. What do you want them to have as their takeaway? What do you want people to learn from this film?
Well, you know, honestly, it's a lot like when I went down there. The word I was not able to use so much in the very beginning was hope. And the truth is now, as this time has passed, as the years have passed, the notion of actually saying that there could possibly be hope that could emerge from this is actually something that I think is possible, and I think the film certainly demonstrates. It also just demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit, how human beings have an incredible ability to deal with something incredibly difficult and then somehow survive, and in some cases, and in many cases, even thrive through it. So for me personally, it's just been remarkable to watch that healing process, both with the people and also, you know, really with the site. The site has come along in a great way.
Well, you call your effort Project Rebirth, and I think that's probably the best way to sum it up.
Yeah, well, you know, it's very true. There's a rebirth that's happening there, and certainly with the subjects of the film, there's a rebirth that's happening with them, and that's the emotional and physical balance that the film is really capturing, and we'll have it for release in the next coming years. So look forward to bringing it out to the world.
Well, thanks for taking time today. Thanks for sharing some of the clips. Very fascinating. We look forward to seeing the full film.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me.
All right, Jim Whitaker. Well, we all have stories of one sort or another from that terrible day on 9/11. CBS News producer Kia Baskerville, for example, was part of the traveling White House press corps that day, and she spent the hardest day of President Bush's presidency right by his side. Kaylee Hartung spoke with Kia about that experience.
Would I say it's a highlight of my career? Absolutely not. It's the most horrifying part of my career I've been through so far.
Kia was the television network's designated producer for President Bush's trip to Florida that day. The motorcade had just arrived at a local elementary school when news began to break.
I received a phone call from our local transmission pool producer who said to me, Kia, a plane has just hit one of the World Trade Center buildings. But I said, okay, well, you know, I'll try to get whatever information I can from the administration. If I have to ask the president about it, I will. Normally, when you're traveling with the president, you're running. And you're running, they want to get the press in, they want to get the writers and reporters in to the actual speech site, so the president really doesn't have to wait. But that morning, interestingly enough, we stood outside of the school for about 20 minutes trying to figure out what's going on.
The press corps was eventually herded into the classroom, but Kia got another call before the president entered the room.
My phone rings, and it's actually my correspondent, Mark Knoller. He calls and he says, Kia, it appears as if a second plane has hit the other tower of the World Trade Center. It looks as if this is deliberate. You need to ask the president about this. And that's when I knew that there was something really wrong.
Moments later, the president walked in.
You know, it was interesting. I mean, he just had like no expression. He was expressionless. He went on as a leader should, and you know, greeted the children. And then it was a few minutes later when his chief of staff at the time, Andrew Card, you know, interrupted him. And at that point, he was being informed about the second plane hitting the World Trade Tower.
The president ended his session with the kids and headed for the exit. The press corps was shuffled into another room, and the president gave his first address of the day.
And the next thing I know, we were hustled out, running faster than I think we've ever run before. I mean, a sprint to the motorcade, because he was not going to wait for the press. We all came to the realization that we had no idea what was going to happen next. And that's when we heard that a plane had just hit the Pentagon. And we all looked at each other and we said, you know what, the United States is under attack right now, and we happen to be with the leader of the free world. That started making me wonder, well, is it possible there's been a threat made against the president or Air Force One, which we're about to get on?
On board Air Force One, just feet away from the president, the press corps did what everyone else at home was doing. They watched TV.
The very first picture I saw was the World Trade Center smoking. And shortly after, I think as we started taxiing, roughly, the World Trade Center started collapsing.
Kia had no idea where they were going, but after 2 hours in the air, it was clear they were not going to Washington.
At that point, we literally demanded, we, meaning the rest of the press corps there, we had to talk to someone. There's a guy named Gordon Jandro at the time who came back and said, listen, it's pretty obvious we're not going back to D.C. I am not going to tell you where we're going, but once we get there, don't turn your cell phones on. No one can know where we are.
Soon enough, they were on the ground in Louisiana at Barksdale Air Force Base. Here, the president delivered his second set of remarks for the day.
All the networks broke in, no matter what the programming was at the time.
With Air Force One at risk, the press corps traveling with the president was cut to the bare minimum. Kia and others were put on a separate government plane back to D.C.
Now, I remember looking out the left side of the plane as we were getting ready to land, and I just saw this smolder in the air. And I saw these, you know, clouds rising, these plumes of smoke rising from what was the Pentagon.
She landed at Andrews Air Force Base and headed straight back to work at the White House.
I'm thinking I'm going to go home and be with my family and friends, but the day's not over.
The president would address the nation from the Oval Office at 9 p.m.
Minutes before he was about to go on live, he ran through his speech, and you know, he made it very clear that he wanted no movement, no interruption, no talking, no nothing during his speech, which, you know, obviously I can understand that. And I just looked up at him and said, Mr. President, you need to know that I'm going to be counting you down. So just keep an eye on me, and we'll get through this. And that's kind of how my day ended, was literally going, you know, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And at the end of his speech,
today,
he sat there, again, with just would look like just emotionless, even though there was a lot of emotion going on the inside.
Deadly terrorist acts.
We just let him, you know, we just let him sit there. I think he sat there for a good 2 or 3 minutes, just at the desk when he finished, and no one moved. And he looks up at me, and I look, you know, sort of down at him sitting at the desk, and I just kind of gave him a nod, you know, as if to say it's, you know, it's going to be okay. And he says to me, "Nice job today."
CBS producer Kia Baskerville remembering 9/11 to our reporter Kaylee Hartung. Of course, on this day especially, our thoughts go out to all of the victims and all of the families from 9/11. Thanks to you for watching Washington Unplugged, and join us again on Monday at 12:30 p.m. right here at CBSNews.com. I'm Bob Orr. Have a good weekend.